The manor house where Soren lived was technically pack territory, but it existed in a state of carefully maintained invisibility. Built into the Carpathian foothills, hidden from human eyes by isolation and deliberate supernatural obfuscation, it housed the pack's unmarked wolves, those whose genetic markers indicated they would never achieve alpha status, never dominate a hunt, never matter in the hierarchy. They were called the domestic pack, though that wasn't an official designation. It was simply what everyone called them. The wolves who cooked and cleaned and maintained the physical infrastructure that allowed the true pack to focus on the business of power. Soren had been born into the domestic pack. She'd known from early childhood that her body was wrong in the ways that mattered to werewolves. She was smaller than her littermates. Her reflexes were slower. Her wolf form lacked the aggressive dominance that characterized the alphas and their chosen warriors. She simply was not built for hierarchy, so she cleaned instead. She cooked. She mended the clothes of wolves who saw her as a necessity like running water or gas lamps, useful infrastructure that didn't require acknowledgement. She worked 18-hour days, received minimal rations, and slept in a servant's chamber barely larger than a closet. 23 years of this. 23 years of being invisible in a house full of people who saw her only when they had demands to make. 23 years of understanding with absolute certainty that this was the entirety of her existence. There would be no escape. There would be no alternative. There would only be work, invisibility, and the slow decay of youth into irrelevance. She began planning her escape on the night she watched a kitchen wolf, barely older than she was, receive a beating for burning dinner. The alpha who administered the punishment didn't even seem angry. He simply struck with the casual disinterest of someone correcting a tool. The kitchen wolf curled into herself, making the mewling sounds that the pack found acceptable from defective creatures. Soren realized in that moment that acceptance was death. Compliance was surrender. The only thing worse than the domestic pack's invisibility would be accepting that invisibility as inevitable. That night, she stole bread and a warm cloak. She studied the boundary markers that kept pack territory separate from the wilderness. And 3 days later, when the household was distracted by a hunting expedition, she ran. The wolves who caught her at the boundary were not pack trackers. They were boundary patrol, the designated enforcers who maintained the territorial separation between pack lands and the wilderness beyond. They were larger than Soren, more aggressive, bred specifically for the purpose of preventing trespass. She almost made it through the boundary markers. She could see the wilderness beyond, could smell the freedom of unclaimed territory, could feel the world opening up before her. Then teeth closed around her ankle, jerking her backward with force that dislocated her joint. She screamed. The sound was part rage and part animal panic, the sound of a creature who'd never been trained for violence experiencing violence for the first time. The boundary wolves didn't hesitate. To them, she was a defective attempting escape. She was a failure trying to leave the place designated for failures. She was a problem that needed to be solved. They didn't kill her immediately. That would have been mercy. Instead, they played with her in the way that predators play, taking her down, pinning her, allowing her to struggle enough to feel the futility of it before pinning her again. Her screams alerted the rest of the boundary patrol. Within minutes, there were 5 wolves on her, all of them pack-bred and stronger than she could ever be. Her ribs cracked under their weight. Her face was torn open by teeth. Her left arm was nearly severed. She could feel her own blood pooling beneath her, could taste it in her mouth, could comprehend with absolute clarity that she was dying. When they finally left her, bleeding out in the boundary ravine, it was only because they'd lost interest in her. She'd stopped struggling. She'd stopped making the sounds that provoked their aggression. She was simply a broken body, and broken bodies were no longer entertaining. She lay there in her own blood, fading in and out of consciousness, understanding that her escape attempt had been the worst possible choice. She should have accepted the domestic pack. She should have kept her head down. She should have died slowly of obscurity instead of quickly of her own ambition. She was dying when Dmitri found her. Dmitri had been traveling through the Carpathians to meet with his northern territories when he caught the scent of fresh blood mixed with the distinct musk of werewolf. Not a hunt. Hunts had a different scent, a different quality. This was violence. This was punishment. He found her in the ravine, her human form broken and bleeding, her wolf form too damaged to maintain. She was conscious enough to feel his presence, her eyes widening with fear when she realized what he was. A vampire, the enemy that pack mothers used to frighten misbehaving cubs, the creature that haunted werewolf nightmares. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "If you're going to kill me, just do it quickly." Dmitri assessed the damage. Her injuries were catastrophic. Without intervention, she would die within hours. With human medicine, she might survive as a cripple, permanently broken by the extent of the trauma. There was one option that would save her completely, that would not only restore her body but give her power beyond anything the werewolves who'd beaten her could ever achieve. He could turn her. It should have been impossible. Werewolves and vampires were antithetical at a cellular level. The transformation should have killed her. But Dmitri was old enough, powerful enough, and absolutely certain about his own dominance to attempt what shouldn't be possible. He took her to Castle Várad, carrying her broken body back to his fortress like a prize. He brought her to his chambers, not the guest quarters, but his personal space, the heart of his power. Over 3 days, he infused her with his blood, forced her cellular structure to accommodate two natures that should have been mutually exclusive, and transformed her into something that shouldn't exist. When she woke, she was something new. Soren's first conscious thought after the transformation was rage, so pure it nearly fractured her mind. She was alive, but alive was wrong. She was transformed, but transformation was monstrous. She could feel the vampire essence that now lived in her cells, coexisting with her wolf nature in ways that made her skin burn with the fundamental wrongness of it. She tried to kill Dmitri. The attempt was pathetic. Her hybrid form was unstable, her body still healing from the mauling, her mind fractured between two natures that didn't yet know how to coexist. She lunged with partial transformation, her body caught between states, claws extending from hands that were becoming paws. Rage gave her strength that pain couldn't diminish. Dmitri simply moved aside. He didn't fight. He didn't defend himself. He simply allowed her to exhaust herself, allowed her to realize that attacking him was as futile as everything else in her existence. "You should have let me die," she spat, the words distorted by the partial transformation of her face. "You turned me into this thing. You made me an abomination. You destroyed whatever I was." "I saved your life," Dmitri said calmly. "I understand that feels like destruction." She wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the injustice of it, that she'd chosen freedom and instead found herself trapped in a body that was no longer entirely her own. But underneath the rage was an undeniable truth. She was alive. The infection from her wounds was gone. The damage that should have crippled her for life was healed. She'd been saved by the one creature in the world she'd been taught to see as enemy. The contradiction made her want to scream until her throat bled. But she couldn't. She could only rage and gradually, over hours and then days, begin to understand that surviving was more complex than she'd anticipated. Dmitri confined her to his quarters for the first weeks, not as punishment, but as practical necessity. Her hybrid form was volatile, her control over transformation erratic. The spaces between wolf and human were dangerous, her body caught in transition, her mind fractured between two natures. She spent those weeks oscillating between fury and the small moments of clarity when she understood that rage was the only weapon she had against gratitude. She needed to hate him, because if she allowed herself to feel anything other than hatred, she would have to acknowledge that the creature she'd been taught to despise had saved her life. She would have to confront the impossible truth. She owed her existence to her enemy. Dmitri treated her with the courtesy of a host, despite her attempts to hurt him, despite her clear desire to escape. He brought her books. He answered questions about her hybrid nature with the patience of someone accustomed to explaining ancient truths to creatures who lived only human-length lives. "What you are is unprecedented," he told her during one conversation. "I've never created a hybrid before. The vampire court will have opinions about that." "Will they kill me?" Soren asked. The question was practical. "Possibly," Dmitri said. "They'll want to examine you, understand you, determine whether you're viable or an abomination to be destroyed. My turning a werewolf without consulting them. It will be seen as a serious breach of protocol." "Then why did you do it?" Dmitri was quiet for a moment. "Because you were dying and I could save you. And because I've lived long enough to understand that the politics of species warfare are less important than the fact of one creature's survival." She wanted to hate him for the answer, but somewhere deep inside, in the parts of her that were still learning to be alive, she found that she couldn't. The weeks passed. Her hybrid form stabilized. Her control improved. And her rage, while never fully disappearing, became something she could live with rather than something that consumed her entirely. The letter arrived by courier, sealed with crimson wax. Dmitri opened it with deliberate slowness, already knowing its contents. "We're being called to Vienna," he said. "The court wants to assess you, determine whether you're viable or whether I've made a catastrophic error that needs correcting." Correcting meaning executed. "Yes." Soren stood at the window of her chamber, looking out over the Carpathian landscape. She'd spent her entire life confined to the manor house, then briefly in the wilderness, then in this castle. She'd never traveled, never been outside the boundaries of territory and servitude. Now she was being escorted across the continent to face judgment from creatures she'd been taught to fear. "Will they listen to you?" she asked. "You're their king. Kings have power that's conditional on the support of their courts," Dmitri said. "They'll listen to me. Whether they'll obey me is another matter." The journey to Vienna took 3 weeks. Soren experienced it as education. She saw the railways transforming the continent in 1880, the industrialization pushing supernatural creatures into narrower territories as human civilization expanded. She understood viscerally that the world was changing in ways that would affect both species. She also understood that Dmitri was preparing her, not to make her sympathetic to his cause, but to ensure she would survive what was coming. A girl who understood nothing about vampire politics wouldn't last 5 minutes in the court's presence. By the time they arrived in Vienna, she understood the basic structure of vampire hierarchy, the history of species conflicts, and the political calculations that determined life and death in their world. The vampire court of Vienna was held in an ancient palace designed to make supplicants feel small. Soren stood beside Dmitri in human form as the assembled court regarded her with varying degrees of fascination and disgust. The Countess Isabeau spoke first. Ancient, predatory, her eyes absolutely empty. "You've brought a werewolf into our sacred space." "A hybrid," Dmitri corrected. "Created through my own blood, my own choice, without consulting the council." "Without consulting the council," Dmitri acknowledged. There was a pause. The court seemed to be computing whether this was an unforgivable violation or merely a significant one. Soren realized that the distinction probably mattered enormously in vampire politics, even if it was lost on her. Isabeau studied Soren with intensity that made her skin crawl. "Let us see what you actually are." Soren didn't look to Dimitri for permission. Showing weakness would be fatal. She shifted into wolf form, a full transformation that left her human clothing in tatters and her hybrid nature visible in the luminescence of her fur. The way her wolf eyes reflected light differently than a pure-blooded werewolf's would. The court's reaction was immediate. She could smell the mixture of emotions: hunger, revulsion, fascination, fear. Some of them wanted her dead. Some of them wanted to understand her. A few seemed to be mentally calculating how to weaponize her existence. "She's beautiful," one of the younger vampires said. "And abominable." "Both," Isabeau agreed. "The question is whether she's dangerous to us or useful." The assembled court seemed to lean forward simultaneously, assessing, calculating, determining her value in ways that made her fur bristle with recognition of predatory intelligence focused entirely upon her. The court's decision came 3 days later. Soren would be permitted to remain, provided she submitted to regular assessment and maintained residence at Castle Várad under Dimitri's direct authority. She was viable as a hybrid, but her existence complicated vampire law in ways that required monitoring. What was more complicated was what it did to Dimitri's political position. By creating a hybrid without court approval, Dimitri had committed a constitutional violation. That he'd succeeded, that the resulting creature was viable and grudgingly acceptable to the court, didn't erase the breach. His authority shifted. Some saw him as willing to challenge their rules. Others saw him as having endangered them all with a unilateral decision. The Countess Isabeau, particularly, seemed to be calculating how to use this moment to diminish his influence. When Dimitri returned to their chambers, he carried the weight of political consequences that Soren didn't fully comprehend. She only knew that his shoulders carried tension that hadn't been there before, and that her presence in his life had made him more vulnerable than he'd been before. "They're going to use me to control you," she said. "Not a question." "Yes," Dimitri said. "That's likely. Then you should have let me die." He looked at her with an expression she was learning to recognize. Exhaustion mixed with something that might have been affection. "I could no more have done that than I could stop being what I am." The carriage ride back to Castle Várad was silent. Soren could feel the weight of what her existence meant, not just for her survival, but for his political position, for the delicate balance of power he'd maintained for centuries. And yet he didn't regret it. That was what frightened her most. He didn't regret saving her, even knowing the cost. As weeks turned into months, Soren began to understand the nature of what she'd become. The hybrid state that should have been monstrous was actually unprecedented power. She could shift between wolf and human form with perfect control. She could manifest abilities from both species, the strength and predatory grace of the vampire combined with the sensory acuity that characterized werewolves. Most importantly, she could perceive things that pure-blooded members of either species couldn't. She could sense the difference between vampire glamour and reality. She could feel the spiritual signature of wolves in ways vampires never could. She existed in the spaces between, and those spaces gave her clarity that neither parent species possessed. Dimitri taught her to use these abilities. Not to fight, she would never be a warrior in the traditional sense, but to perceive, to understand, to move through both worlds with the fluency of someone who belonged to both and neither. "You're something new," he told her during training in the castle's grounds. "That terrifies the court because they don't know how to classify you. But it should terrify you most of all because you're going to have to decide who you are independent of what either species says you should be. She was beginning to understand that Dimitri's rescue hadn't been entirely altruistic. He'd created her because she could become what neither vampires nor werewolves could be: a bridge between species, an ambassador to a world changing too fast for traditional politics. He'd also created her because in 6 centuries of existence, he'd never found another creature who understood the price of being exceptional in a world that demanded conformity. And somewhere in those months of teaching, somewhere in those moments when she demonstrated a new ability or understood a truth about her hybrid nature, she began to understand that she might feel something other than rage and gratitude. She might feel something dangerous. She might feel love. It happened 3 months after her arrival at Castle Várad. Soren was in the library, reading by gaslight, one of the newer technological marvels that Dimitri had introduced to his medieval castle. Dimitri entered with a document that required her attention, and for the first time, she looked at him without anger in her chest. He was ancient and terrifying and responsible for the forced transformation of her entire existence. He was also profoundly beautiful, not in conventional ways, but in the way only creatures living on civilization's edge could be beautiful. With the kind of beauty that spoke of centuries of surviving, of understanding the world in ways younger creatures couldn't fathom. "What?" he asked, noticing her stare. "I don't hate you anymore," she said. The words came as confession. "I've been trying to maintain the hatred. It was the only way to protect myself from the debt. But I don't hate you. I don't know what I feel, but it's not hate." Dimitri set the document aside. He moved toward her with careful precision, giving her time to pull away if she chose. "Good, because I've never hated you, and I'm tired of the weight of that being entirely on my side." She rose to meet him. When he took her hand, she felt the warmth of his skin. Not the cold of the undead, but something more complex. His blood was running warm because he'd been hunting, feeding, living. His vampire nature was rooted in vitality, not death. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Dimitri said. "We figure out how to survive what comes next, together." The werewolf territories learned about her existence in the way supernatural communities learned about everything. Through rumor, fear, and the slow spreading of stories that grew more elaborate with each retelling. A defective had escaped the domestic pack. She'd been caught and beaten and left for dead. She'd been rescued by the vampire king himself. She'd been transformed into something that shouldn't exist. Pack leaders held emergency councils. The Crimson Fang pack called for her execution. The Blackthorn pack, territorial neighbors to Castle Várad, demanded explanations that never quite satisfied them. More distant packs simply watched, calculating how this development affected their positions in a world changing faster than their traditions could accommodate. The pack that had originally held Soren had no comment. She'd been defective. She'd tried to escape. The Boundary Patrol had dealt with her. By pack law, she no longer existed. Soren didn't set out to become a symbol of rebellion. But symbols require nothing but existence and the willingness of others to project meaning onto them. She was becoming legend even before she left Castle Várad, becoming a story told in hushed voices among the marked wolves who'd always accepted their position as inevitable. The second letter arrived in spring, and this time the summons was for Dimitri alone. Isabeau wanted to discuss the future of his hybrid and appropriate use of her abilities within the court structure. What that meant, Dimitri explained to Soren, was that the court had figured out how to weaponize her. "They're going to ask you to be an ambassador," he told her, "to negotiate with the werewolf packs, to convince them that vampire interests and werewolf interests might align on certain issues. They'll make it sound like a position of power and respect. In reality? In reality, they're going to put you in constant danger from both sides. The packs will see you as a traitor. My court will see you as expendable if negotiations fail. You'll be caught between, belonging to neither, trusted by both only as long as you're useful. Will you let them do it? Soren asked. The question contained a subtext built over months. Do you care enough about what happens to me to refuse? Dmitri was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, he finally said. Because if I refuse, they'll find another way to use you. If I agree, at least I can control the terms. But either way, you're going to be in danger. That's the price of being what you are, the first of your kind, the bridge between species, the impossible thing that shouldn't exist but does. I didn't ask for this, Soren said. No, Dmitri agreed. But you've survived it. And now you're going to have to decide whether you survive it by running or by embracing it. Soren stood in the courtyard of Castle Várad, her hands pressed against ancient stone that had stood for centuries and would likely stand for centuries more. She could feel the vibrations of the earth beneath her palms, the werewolf nature in her responding to the ancient pulse of the land. She could also feel the weight of centuries in the stone itself, the vampire history soaked into these walls. She was a creature that could perceive both. That meant she could navigate both. That also meant she would forever claim partial allegiance to neither. I'll do it, she told Dmitri when he found her in the courtyard. I'll be the ambassador. I'll negotiate between your court and the packs. But I need you to understand what that means. I'm no longer just surviving. I'm choosing to matter, knowing it will make me vulnerable. Yes, Dmitri said. And I need to know, she continued, whether you're doing this because you care about me or because you care about your own position. It was the question that would determine everything else that came after. Dmitri moved toward her slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose. When she didn't, he took her hand. I'm doing it, he said, because I've lived 600 years and never found another creature who understood me the way you're beginning to, because I saved your life for selfish reasons, and I'm apparently going to spend the rest of my existence paying the consequences of that selfishness. And because, against all strategic calculation, against all political wisdom, against every rule I've ever been taught, I'm in love with you. It was the most dangerous thing he could have said. Love made him vulnerable. Love made her vulnerable. But vulnerability, Soren was learning, was the only thing that made anything real. I hate that I love you, she whispered. I know, Dmitri said. But you do. The first werewolf delegation came in early summer. Blackthorn Pack representatives, sent to assess whether the hybrid was propaganda or actual threat. Soren met them in the great hall of Castle Várad in human form, not to appear weak, but to appear bridge-like, a form that belonged to both species and neither. The lead representative was named Torsten, an aging alpha who'd seen enough of the world to understand that times were changing. He studied her with the assessment of a creature who'd spent decades learning to read deception. You're defective, he said. Not a question. Yes, Soren confirmed. You escaped the domestic pack. Yes. You were caught at the boundary and mauled. And the vampire king saved you. Yes. Torsten smiled. The smile of a creature who'd seen empires rise and fall. And now you're going to sit in his halls and negotiate on his behalf while the pack that tried to kill you watches from the territories. Now I'm something that shouldn't exist according to either species law, Soren said. But I do exist. And the question isn't whether I'm real. The question is whether you're going to pretend I don't exist, or whether you're going to adapt to the fact that I do. Torsten studied her in silence. You understand that the court sent you here to spy on us? Yes. And you'll report back what we say? Yes, Soren said. But I'll also report whether you're reasonable, whether you're open to the possibility that the world is changing, and that the old certainties about species warfare might be less helpful than they used to be. And what do you get out of this? Torsten asked. Why would you advocate for us to a court that's still deciding whether to destroy you? Soren thought about the ravine, about the fever and the fever dreams, about the moment when Dimitri's blood had transformed her into something impossible, about the choice she'd made to be more than a symbol of rebellion. Because, she said quietly, I'm still one of you, even turned, even transformed, even caught between. I understand what it means to be deemed worthless by your own species. The pack that owned me saw me as infrastructure, useful only for cleaning and cooking and labor. When I tried to escape, they nearly killed me for it. I won't pretend that the packs are innocent in creating creatures like me, but I also won't pretend that the answer is extinction. Torsten was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. That's a start. Dimitri wrote it on expensive paper, using ink that would last centuries. Soren found it on her pillow before her first diplomatic journey, a confession in his careful handwriting. To the creature I saved, without asking her permission. I found you broken at the boundary, left for dead by wolves who saw you as worthless. I turned you to save your life, but I've come to understand that saving your life wasn't the only reason I did it. Not really. I did it because I'm 600 years old and I was tired of being alone. I did it because you were fierce even in your fever dreams, and I needed to know what that fierceness would become if given the chance to survive. I did it because I looked at you dying and I couldn't bear to let go of the possibility of what you might become. I love you. That's not strategy. It's not politics. It's not a play for power. It's something far more dangerous. It's the simple fact of one creature recognizing another creature, and choosing to build a life with them despite knowing it will cost both of us everything. Go negotiate with the packs. Be the bridge between our species. Change the world if you can. But know that you do it with the full weight of my heart behind you, and the absolute certainty that I would make the same choice again. To save you, to turn you, to love you, even knowing it would make us both vulnerable to forces we can't control. Love doesn't obey the laws of species. It never has. That's what makes it the most revolutionary force in our world. Soren read the letter while standing at the window of her chamber, looking out over the Carpathian landscape that had become home. She'd arrived at this castle as the broken result of her own ambition. She was leaving it as something far more dangerous. A creature in love with the being who'd saved her, committed to using her impossible existence to change a world that wasn't ready for her. The carriage that would take her to the first official negotiation rolled out of Castle Várad on a morning when fog clung to the mountains like a living thing. Soren sat inside, dressed in the finest clothes the vampire court could procure. An 1880s gown that was simultaneously armor and prison, the costume of a creature who belonged to both worlds and neither. Dimitri stood on the steps of the castle, watching her go. She could see him through the window, and she understood what the weight of his expression meant. Every choice she made in the territories would cost him something. Every negotiation was a gamble with his own position. Every moment she spent away was a moment he had to defend his decision to save her to a court still calculating whether it was right. But he didn't call her back. Instead, as the carriage moved away, she watched him turn and walk back into the castle alone, going to face the consequences of his choice, going to hold his position against those who would use her existence against him, going to love her from a distance because that was the price of their love. Complicated, dangerous, revolutionary. The 1880s were changing the world. Trains moved faster. Technology advanced. In this world of unprecedented change, a hybrid werewolf-vampire ambassador traveling between species territories felt less impossible than it might have a century earlier. But it was still the most revolutionary thing anyone in either species could have imagined. A creature who belonged to both, claiming the right to negotiate peace between ancient enemies. A symbol that maybe, just maybe, the future didn't have to be ruled by the certainties of the past.